So we've got a lot to cover today, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. Again, for those of you in the back, there are some seats up front if you'd like to work your way up. My name is Donn-Morrill. I'm a Solutions Architect Manager for Amazon Web Services. I lead our solutions architecture teams in New York and Boston. Today we're going to be talking about orchestration and deployment options for hybrid enterprise environments. That's a pretty big mouthful. As you can imagine, there's a lot of enterprise companies that we're working with in the Northeast that are coming to us and saying, how do we operate a hybrid environment on AWS? I was glad to hear Andy talk a little bit about hybrid in this morning's keynote. I think some of the things that he said are going to dovetail nicely, and they make a nice segue into the conversation that we're going to have today. We're going to start by setting a little bit of context, define hybrid as it comes to the conversation we're going to have today, talk about some of the considerations, why are enterprises considering moving to a hybrid model, and then we're going to lay out a decision framework that we can use as we lay out orchestration and deployment strategies. Decision framework is going to help you understand which of those is going to be applicable to your enterprise. Let's start with a definition of hybrid cloud. This is the only two slides, this slide and the next slide, that I'm going to read to you, and I promise I'll stop reading from then on. So according to NIST, in September of 2011, they defined hybrid cloud as a composition of two or more distinct cloud infrastructures that remain unique entities, but are bound together by standardization or proprietary technology that enables data and application portability. It's interesting to point out in this definition that it doesn't make a distinction between a public cloud and a private cloud. Nowhere does it mention that this is a private data center versus a public cloud. And so in theory, according to this definition, a hybrid cloud could be two separate public cloud providers working in concert to offer services. But in the typical definition, we're usually talking about a private cloud environment and a public cloud environment, such as AWS. I'd like to stretch that definition a little bit further and say that private cloud isn't a necessity for a hybrid environment. And I'm going to ask you all to raise your hands in just a minute after I outlay a series of questions for you. For the purpose of this discussion, we're going to assume that the private cloud could simply be your data center. And the reason I want to do that is because I'm going to take a show of hands in just a second. I'd be curious how many people in the audience are truly running a private cloud. You heard Andy talk about a private cloud and what people think a private cloud might be versus what a public cloud and all the extra benefits that the public cloud brings to the table. And so I think we need to broaden this definition where the private part of the hybrid cloud is really just your corporate data center. So by show of hands, how many people think you are or are truly running a private cloud versus how many people are just running maybe highly virtualized data centers? Private clouds? Okay, maybe 15% of the audience, and just virtualized data centers. Great, so my assumption is true in that I think if we broaden the scope of hybrid cloud, the definition a little bit, we'll all have a better frame of reference for this discussion. No talk would be complete without the requisite quote from Gardner. So let me throw it up there and get it out of the way. Why is everybody here at this discussion today? Nearly half of large enterprises will have hybrid cloud deployments by the end of 2017. Might seem like a long time from now, but for those of you in the enterprise IT space, 2014 to 2017 is not a lot of time, and there's a lot of work to be done. And we're going to touch on some of the strategies that can help you move in that direction. Why hybrid cloud? Why do enterprises consider hybrid cloud? From my perspective, what enterprises are asking us for are all the things that the public cloud provides. What are the benefits that the public cloud provides? You heard Andy talk about them this morning. Agility, the ability to react quickly and take advantage of the innovation that's happening within your organization. The economies, you heard Andy talk about our different pricing model, whether it be on-demand, spot, or reserved instances, and scale. The ability to allocate thousands or tens of thousands of servers and petabytes of storage and all the other services that AWS offers. Those are the great things that the cloud provides, and that's why people are moving towards the cloud. So why a hybrid environment then? Essentially, I see hybrid environment as when something is getting in the way in your journey to the cloud. Maybe there's compliance issues. Maybe there's some legal entity from above that is simply saying, thou shalt run that workload in our four walls, period, full stop, end of story. And for whatever reason, that workload can't leave your data center. Maybe you have a previous investment. You've purchased servers. You've purchased a building. You've purchased air conditioning equipment. And you don't want to leave that investment behind just yet. Maybe you have legacy workloads. I think Andy talked a little bit about legacy workloads as well. Maybe you have AS400s sitting in the corner of your data center that aren't quite ready to migrate to the cloud yet. Or maybe it's just an attitude thing that is preventing you from moving to the cloud. Some people like to walk into a server room and see those lights flashing. Some people enjoy the excitement of tripping over a WAN cable on Thanksgiving weekend and spending their Thanksgiving weekend restoring service. Those people are out there. Affectionately at AWS, we like to call them server huggers. But over time, all things do change. What are enterprises looking for in cloud? What are they coming to us saying, this is why we're looking at a hybrid model? They want the ability to deploy identical stacks in both environments. If you're running a LAMP stack, a PHP stack with a database on premises, you want to be able to run that same stack in the cloud. You don't have to necessarily make big changes to that stack in order to bring it over to a public cloud environment. You want interoperability between the clouds, and we're going to talk about that when we talk about application deployment strategies. You want to be able to deploy certain layers of your application in the cloud and have them work with your legacy and on-premises data center applications as well. And at the heart of this conversation, you want the ability to leverage one provisioning framework, and you want the ability to leverage one operational framework. And a little bit later on in this conversation, we're going to define what does orchestration mean and what does application deployment mean. But essentially, you want that single pane of glass to operate both your environments. Let's first look at some of the considerations as you're considering a hybrid strategy. It kind of helps lay the groundwork as we get into some of the strategies for orchestration and deployment. There's lots of considerations, and we're going to consider a couple of them today. Core infrastructure. How do you prepare your core infrastructure to start moving workloads into the cloud? Security, as Andy said again this morning, security is at the top of everyone's mind. It's certainly at the top of AWS's mind. How do you do authentication and entitlements and identity management? The people today that have the ability and the permission to do things in your data center, whether it be to allocate servers, to allocate storage, how do you extend those permissions into the cloud? Data sovereignty. If you're in a traditional data center today, you know where your data is at all times. And that can be true in AWS as well, but it's something to consider. When you use AWS, you immediately get access to 9 different regions, essentially clusters of data centers around the world. So data sovereignty becomes an issue. It's certainly a very solvable issue on AWS, but it's something you need to consider as you go to a hybrid model. And then operations and monitoring. We'll talk a little bit about that when we talk about orchestration. A couple more considerations. Cost containment. One of the beauty things of the cloud is that we like to think of it as a utility model. When you turn on that server, you pay for it, and when you don't need it anymore, you simply turn it off. Combine that with the ability to allocate thousands and thousands of servers and petabytes of storage. Those are really unique attributes of the cloud. But there comes some responsibility with that to understand what your cost model is going to look like and make sure that you don't have, you probably heard the term before, VM sprawl, right? You don't want to leave thousands and thousands of servers running and thousands of volumes lying around. AWS provides you with some tools and capabilities to help make sure that you keep your costs under control, but it's something you need to consider in a hybrid environment because it's a new model from operating your traditional data center. Pace of innovation. You heard today a couple new big feature announcements, and to date, I think we've launched over 230 features and capabilities just this year. What are your requirements from an innovative perspective? I can guarantee you that your data center, the 4 walls that you're operating today, are not innovating as rapidly as AWS is. So how do you maintain feature parity with AWS and your traditional legacy data centers? And then cloud orchestration. That's obviously a big part of the conversation that we're going to have a little bit later on today, as is application deployment. And don't forget about change management. All you Six Sigma black belts out there, put your hats on because you've got a lot of work to do when it comes to hybrid cloud. Today we're going to focus on 3 of those considerations. We're going to talk a little bit about core infrastructure. And we're going to go into really the meat of the conversation, which is orchestration strategies. And we're going to talk about application deployment strategies. Orchestration strategies are really, how do I control and provision my infrastructure? How do I allocate servers? How do I set up my networking? How do I monitor it? How do I allocate storage? Where application deployment strategies are really about, how do I move my stacks onto the cloud? How do I do my operating system patching? How do I move a PHP app? How do I do continuous integration in the cloud? So we're going to look at both the orchestration strategies and we're going to look at application strategies, moving your application layers into the cloud or into a hybrid model, per se. And you'll recognize this diagram from this morning's conversation. Let's talk a little bit about first preparing your core infrastructure for a hybrid environment. Just like everything else, everybody's heard this before, but everything should be driven by business requirements. And that's not different for your core infrastructure considerations. What are your performance and your latency requirements? What are your business continuity requirements? And your geography requirements and your data sovereignty requirements? To some extent, business continuity and performance and latency is going to be driven by geography. If you've got customers in Asia Pacific, consider using the AWS regions that we have available in Asia Pacific. Do you have European data privacy requirements? Consider using our region in Europe, in Ireland. What are your security requirements? All those things have to go into consideration when you're laying out your infrastructure plans. Let's take a quick look at some relevant AWS services. You're familiar with some of these, I'm sure. And these are particularly applicable when we're talking about a hybrid cloud environment. So Amazon Virtual Private Cloud, or VPC, is essentially a way for you to overlay your networking topology into the cloud. It makes the cloud, you carve out your own little piece of the cloud, and it can make it look like an extension of your data center. If you're running a private 10-dot network in your data center today, you can very easily extend that network so that when people start using servers in your environment, they don't even know if their servers running in your data center or their servers running in the AWS cloud. It kind of ties everything together very nicely. AWS Direct Connect is the ability to get a private, dedicated connection directly into the AWS cloud. A lot of our customers are perfectly happy accessing AWS services over the public internet, whether it be over the regular internet or over a VPN connection. But some of them, either for compliance reasons, security reasons, or just for performance reasons, they want that dedicated private fiber going into the AWS cloud. And Direct Connect comes in different flavors, from 10 gigabits to 1 gigabit, and then fractions of a gigabit there. So as much bandwidth in and out of the cloud as you need, you can provision it with AWS Direct Connect. Identity and access management, we talked a little bit about that earlier, and we're going to talk about it more, but how do I make sure that the things that I can do in my four walls of my data center today apply into AWS as well? And you can see underneath each of those service names, there are a couple sessions this week on those services, so if you're interested in learning more specifically about them, ARC310 on Wednesday at 1:30, which is today, and also Wednesday at 1:30 is the IAM session. You have to choose which one you want to go to. And then AWS Direct Connect, we've got a session at Friday at 9 a.m. talking about that. A few more services that make sense in a hybrid environment. CloudFormation. CloudFormation is the ability to script in software in a JSON-like syntax all of your AWS resources, and then push that script into the CloudFormation engine, and it will spin up all your resources for you on demand. You've all heard the term the software-defined data center. This is a big step in that direction. VM import-export is the ability to take virtualized machines in your data center and move them to AWS, so you can move virtual workloads back and forth. The AWS Management Pack for Microsoft System Center. This isn't so much a big feature, but it's really important when we start to talk about hybrid. We have a plugin available for Microsoft System Center. So for those of you that are Microsoft shops and are managing your data center today, using those tools, you can download that plugin and start managing your AWS resources from that single pane of glass. Probably one of the shortest routes to a hybrid environment. Download it, 15 minutes, plug it in, voila, instant hybrid cloud. And then finally, the AWS APIs, SDK, and tools. Some of you already know this, but every service that Amazon offers today is first and foremost available through a series of RESTful APIs. So you can invoke all of our services and capabilities programmatically. And then we layer on top of that command line tools and software development kits so that you can build really unique applications on top of that. And one of the strategies for orchestration that we're going to talk about today makes use of the APIs and SDKs that we have available. So let's talk about hybrid orchestration strategies. We'll get in a little bit of the meat of this conversation. Before we start that, I want to lay out a really quick decision matrix, a framework for you as your organization starts thinking about hybrid. What are some of the attributes that your organization has to have, and how do those drive your different orchestration decisions? So I've laid out 4 dimensions here: organizational buy-in, IT capabilities, IT vision, and then AWS experience. And there's probably a bunch of others, but I think these are probably the most relevant when it comes to hybrid strategy. And then I've laid them out into a low, medium, and high. So in terms of organizational buy-in, if you have no organizational buy-in for a cloud environment or grassroots, maybe you've got some of these what we call shadow IT operations going on, you may or may not be ready for a hybrid environment. But as you move your way up in terms of organizational buy-in, maybe at the divisional level, maybe you've got divisions in your enterprise that are big enough that they're operating their own data centers. And so maybe when you start to get divisional level buy-in for a hybrid or for a cloud environment, then it might start to make a little bit more sense. And certainly we heard Dow Jones this morning talking about the all-in strategy for cloud. When you get that type of buy-in, hybrid starts to make sense. In those cases, when you talk about that all-in strategy, I really view hybrid as kind of a stepping stone, as part of the journey towards a pure cloud environment. Right? The ultimate goal is to get rid of all those legacy servers, but you have to start somewhere, so you start with hybrid. IT capabilities, what are your internal capabilities? If you have no sophisticated in-house IT capabilities or development capabilities, that's going to drive your decision when it comes to hybrid orchestration. Also your partner relationships. Do you work with trusted partners like a Cognizant, like an Accenture, like a Booz Allen? Do you have maybe one trusted partner that you work with? And what are their cloud capabilities as well? How much are they able to help you understand that cloud migration strategy? Or do you have advanced in-house IT capability and development capability? And you have multiple trusted partners who have done this before and work closely with AWS to understand how the cloud works. What's your IT vision? Is your IT vision organizational or operational, excuse me? Is it just to keep the lights on? There's nothing really wrong with that. But if the goal of IT is just to keep those servers running, maybe you have to do some thinking. Maybe your IT organization is starting to be more forward-thinking, or maybe they're cutting edge and innovative, like we heard with SunGard this morning. And what's your AWS experience today? Is it none or limited? Do you have some experience, or do you have extensive experience? And of the four, I think that one's probably the least important, because there's lots of people at AWS and some of our trusted partners that can help you get started and move you along that bottom dimension pretty quickly. So as we start to look at orchestration strategies, tool sets are going to be a big part of that. We're going to talk a lot about tool sets today. There are lots of choices out there. Maybe you want to go with some of the enterprise guys like HP, Microsoft, BMC, CA, and VMware. Or maybe you want to go with some of the niche of the specialties that focus purely on cloud or hybrid cloud, companies like RightScale and then Stratius and Cavo. Or maybe you want to go the open source route, and that is a viable option. We're going to talk about that quite a bit today. And there's that name that you're going to see a lot this week, Netflix. But there's also companies like CloudStack and Eucalyptus that can provide some capabilities for us. So as you're considering orchestration and deployment tools for hybrid environments, there's a lot of things to think about. I want to touch on just a few of them very briefly that will, again, help us in our decision-making process when we lay out the strategies for hybrid orchestration. Does it support multiple public clouds? Are you working with other public cloud providers? Understand, could you be working with them in the future? And what are your tool partners' capabilities to support multiple public clouds? Monitoring and alerting, how easily do those tools plug into your existing monitoring and alerting capabilities? We talked a little bit about identity federation already, but how do I take the authentication capabilities that I have in-house today and extend that into the cloud? Service catalog and end-user provisioning. This is something that a lot of enterprises are really interested in. They want to make it really easy for business units who are innovating. You've heard the term before. They want to get rid of the undifferentiated heavy lifting of having to request those servers and wait 10 to 12 weeks for them. So they want to present a service catalog. I need an Oracle database. Hey, end user, push that button. 15 minutes later, you have an Oracle database. So what are the tools capabilities to do service catalog, essentially service aggregation into higher level capabilities, and to allow the end user to self-provision those services? Cost reporting and chargeback. This is something that we hear a lot, time and time again, in the enterprise. It's a different model in the cloud than it is on premises. You buy a whole bunch of hardware, you operate that hardware, and then all the funny money starts to flow around. Well, you used 20 virtual machines for 6 months, so we're going to charge you back this much money. In the cloud, it's different. You're actually paying for just what you use. So when the marketing department spins up 15 servers or spins up an EMR Hadoop cluster for a couple hours, you know down to the penny how much the marketing department just spent in the public cloud environment, and you can pass back actual chargeback to them as opposed to just allocating estimated chunks of dollars based on your data center amortization. and cloud-based operation. Interesting thing to consider, does your tool partner actually operate in the cloud, or do you have to deploy it on premises? Can your tool vendor take advantage of the scalability and the fault tolerance that comes with a cloud-based deployment? So let's look at, given that framework, let's look at 3 orchestration strategies today. We're going to look at native integration, we're going to look at deployment of a brand new orchestration layer, and we're going to look at the extending of your existing orchestration layer into the cloud. We'll start with native integration. And as it sounds, this is essentially build it yourself from scratch. This is the do-it-yourself model. And as I said earlier, all of the AWS services are first and foremost available as a set of API calls and associated software development kits. So it's a perfectly viable option to be able to build a custom orchestration layer that fits exactly what your organization needs. Maybe you have the in-house development skills to do something like this. Maybe you need very fine-grained control over every service that AWS has to offer and all the capabilities of all those services. Maybe licensing costs are a big issue for you, and you don't want to have to pay your tools vendor to take it to the next level. So let's go back to our decision framework. When does native integration make the most sense? Probably makes the most sense when you have sophisticated in-house capability and already have some pretty good AWS experience. I think this is also a pretty cutting-edge and innovative model. Now, I'm not saying that you shouldn't consider this strategy if you're not in the green area, but you might want to think twice about it, and you might want to think about moving your organization in that direction if this is the strategy that you'd be interested in pursuing. Accenture, for example, has built from scratch a hybrid cloud orchestration tool that they use. They had the in-house skills to do it, and they took it one step further and actually productized that and made it available for public consumption. So pretty innovative use of cloud orchestration from scratch for internal purposes, and then also extending that out for others to take advantage of as well. So what are some of the pros of native integration? You can incorporate all of the AWS services or only what you need. We launched some interesting new services this morning. I'm going to bet that not every vendor on that logo soup slide that I just showed you is going to have those capabilities available tomorrow or by the end of the week or by the time you get back to your home base. If you own the source code and you own the capability to extend that, you can incorporate those services into your hybrid cloud as fast as you need them. Also gives you a lot of flexibility. You don't have to incorporate services that you don't want into your orchestration tools. Related, you can react quickly to new features and services. One interesting thing about this is that you don't necessarily have to start from scratch. There are open source tools out there that can help you get a jump start on your trip to a hybrid cloud environment. Companies like Eucalyptus, CloudStack, and of course there's that Netflix name again. Netflix has open sourced many of their cloud management tools, and we'll hear this a lot. You know, Netflix isn't really a hybrid. They're more of a pure cloud model, but you can take what they have and you can build on top of it. So you can take Asgard, which is completely open source. It's their cloud control panel and application deployment tool, and you can extend it into your own data center. And of course, there's no licensing fees. So if you don't want to pay those licensing fees, you don't have to. What are some of the cons of native integration? Well, you need those in-house development skills, or you need a trusted partner that has those capabilities as well. It might take you a while, right? Even if you're leveraging some of those open source packages that I just spoke about, it's probably going to take you a longer time to get everything developed. You have to go through development cycles in order to get ready for that. Your private cloud has to have some type of programmatic access, right? If you don't have a programmatic way to spin up servers and to allocate storage and to provision databases in your four walls in your data center, this approach might not be the best one for you, because then really you're orchestrating just the public cloud and not the private cloud as well. And then support must come from in-house. There's no throat to choke if you're developing the tools yourself. Support has to come from within your organization. Let's look at the second strategy now, which is a new orchestration layer. So invest in new hybrid orchestration tools. This is best when you have moderate time constraints, right? So you might not have the time or the resources to do it yourself, and you want the latest and greatest. You're going to market and you're doing some type of due diligence with tools providers and partners and figuring out what is the right set of capabilities for you, and so you have the ability to make those choices. And it's also best when you probably have trusted partners that can either help you in the decision-making process and in the implementation process. Again, back to our decision framework here, probably makes sense when you're in that medium to high area. Again, if your IT vision is operational, or if you don't have high organizational level buy-in, excuse me, you might want to move your organization to the right a little bit before you consider a brand new orchestration layer. What are some of the pros? You still get flexibility because you're doing due diligence, you're going out and you're seeking the tools that are the best for your needs, the ones that are going to meet the 80%, the 80-20 rule. They're going to meet 80% of the requirements that you have for operating a hybrid environment. You might get multi-cloud support out of the box too. Maybe they support your on-premise VMware environment, maybe they support AWS, and maybe they support some of the other public cloud providers as well. It's faster than do it yourself in most cases. And you're also going to get that vendor-provided support. Some of the cons, licensing costs. Of course, you're going to have to pay for it. You're going to have to buy that package. You're probably going to have to pay the maintenance fees that come with it. You might have to rip and replace some legacy tools. So if you've got some management and orchestration tools that you're using in-house today, and you decide to deploy a new model that takes advantage of the public cloud, you might have to rip out some of those old tools, and along with that comes all the training and the certification and the new processes that you're going to have to develop within your organization as you deploy a new hybrid orchestration layer. One of the cons is maintaining feature parity with AWS. Again, it's probably going to be more challenging for your partner or your vendor to keep up with the pace of innovation at AWS, over 230 features just this year alone, than it would if you did it yourself. And it's going to require some set of specialized skills. Again, you're investing in a new tool, perhaps working with a new partner, and so you're going to have to get trained up on those set of tools. And the third strategy we're going to look at today is extending existing tool sets. Let's say you have a partner today that you're using for orchestration and you really enjoy working with them. Maybe they have the capabilities, maybe they have a new feature release or a new product or a new plugin that's going to help you extend your capabilities into the cloud. This approach is probably best when you have fairly aggressive time constraints. It's probably going to be your fastest way to the cloud. We talked earlier about the AWS plugin for Microsoft System Center. If you're already using System Center today, it's pretty quick to download that plugin and start orchestrating into AWS public cloud. Literally, you can do it in a couple of minutes. Maybe you don't need the latest and greatest. If you're happy with the vendor that you have and you don't want to start looking elsewhere for a new tools vendor, you might have to settle a little in taking the capabilities that they bring to the table. And so that is the strategy that's probably going to make sense for most organizations. Again, the only time you might not consider it is if you don't have at least divisional level support for cloud environments. So what are some of the pros of extending existing tools? No rip and replace. You don't necessarily, there's not a steep learning curve because your team is already familiar with the vendor and with some of the tools and the capabilities that they offer. You're not going to have to generate a lot of new processes. There's still governance work that has to happen on the cloud side, but your teams, for the most part, should be comfortable with that vendor and with that tool set. It can be the fastest path to hybrid, as I just spoke about. You get the vendor-provided support again, and it probably requires the least amount of specialized skills, or even more specifically, the least amount of new skills. Right? So if you've got a partner that you've been working with and they helped you implement your existing orchestration and application deployment tools, it's not a big leap to work with that same vendor and to install the hybrid cloud orchestration tools. What are some of the cons associated with this approach? Maybe it's a limited feature set. Maybe it's not a limited feature set. But again, if you're happy with the vendor that you have today, you're going to take what they have to offer. You know, the last item I have there is it's a good enough approach. Maybe it gets you 80% of the way towards your journey to a hybrid cloud. And the same cons that for the other strategy. The licensing costs, you're still going to have to pay for that new capability, and then maintaining feature parity with AWS. So that was orchestration strategies. Let's shift over and take a look at some application deployment strategies. At the most fundamental level, there's really just two application deployment strategies. I can do it horizontally, or I can do it vertically. Doing it horizontally means I'm going to take certain pieces of workloads. Maybe I'm taking my storage layer. Maybe I'm taking some disaster recovery. or a database layer, and I'm pushing it into the cloud. So if we have a typical n-tier architecture where we have some presentation tier, we have some application or middle tier, and a database tier, maybe it's my database tier that desperately needs that ability to burst into capacity and to grow on demand. And so that becomes a good candidate to move that application layer first into the cloud. And now you've got a really interesting hybrid model where maybe your presentation tier and your application tier are in your four walls and your database tier is in the cloud. Or maybe it's vice versa, where your presentation tier is running in the cloud, and as you have those spiky workloads, you're able to react to them. What are some of the pros to the horizontal approach? You can keep your sensitive layers in-house if you need to. If you need to keep that data or you need to keep those trade secrets in-house, you can keep your database tier in-house and then deploy your application tier or your presentation tier or whatever tier you have to be working with. Maybe you move your storage into the cloud, but you keep the databases in-house. And then you get relatively easier compliance. Again, so for the pieces of your stack that are highly regulated, you can keep those in your four walls and still push out some of the less strictly regulated tiers into the cloud, maybe like the presentation tier. What are some of the cons of this? It can be more complex than the next strategy we're going to talk about, which is moving an entire application into the cloud. And it can also be harder to undo if for some reason you need to leave that public cloud environment. If I move my entire database tier out into the cloud but leave my application and presentation tiers on premise, it might be a little bit more complex to just move that data tier out of one provider and back either in-house or to another provider. Vertical strategy, essentially this is deploying net new workloads into the cloud. Maybe you're doing production workloads that are brand new, or maybe you're doing development and QA. What are some of the pros of this? It's quick to implement. If you're building a net new workload, you heard Andy talk about it this morning, that's a great strategy and a great time to start thinking about hybrid cloud. So maybe you're moving that entire LAMP stack or that entire SAP application or that entire ERP system into the cloud. Maybe you're doing some monitoring and some orchestration from that single pane of glass that we've been talking about. But it's more efficient to move that entire application stack into the cloud. You get good application stack isolation, so everything's going to be in the same environment. It's not as complex as having your database server run in the cloud and having your other tiers run on premises. It's also fairly easy to undo. It's basically a lift and shift. If you need to move from one environment or one provider to another, it's fairly easy to do that. What are some of the cons of this? Is it hybrid? That's really something to consider, right? Does it leverage in-house IT resources? Maybe not. Maybe most of the heavy lifting and the workload is operating in the cloud, but you're still managing it from on-premise, from your monitoring system and your operational systems and your orchestration system. So while the workload itself is operating purely in the public cloud, you're still managing it from that hybrid environment. And you must have well-established governance policies for all the layers, right? And so if I'm moving my application layer, if I'm moving ERP, if I'm moving SAP, if I'm moving Oracle, you have to understand from a process perspective, how do I govern, and from a data sovereignty perspective, how do I govern that application that's now running completely in the cloud? So that's all great. I've laid out 3 strategies for orchestration and 2 strategies for application deployment, but how do I start applying that? Let's look at how we might actually use some of this. And then we'll look at some specific scenarios and some specific considerations. So how do I get started? And you heard Andy talk about this this morning. There's lots of different strategies for getting started in the cloud. And I've listed them in general complexity from easiest to hardest: storage, backup, and archive. That's pretty much a no-brainer, and we're going to talk specifically about how you get started with storage and backup in the cloud in just a couple slides from now. Development and tests, that's a great way to get started as well. You heard Andy talk about the lead time to getting a new development server. If you've got a business unit that has a new idea and it takes them 10 to 12 weeks to get a server, that's a real bummer, and it's going to drive down innovation. And so development test is a great way to just allocate servers and storage and databases and get started innovating very quickly. Net new workloads. So as brand new projects come online, it makes it a lot easier to develop them in a cloud-friendly fashion if you're starting by doing it in the cloud. Disaster recovery. Storage is, and backup and archive is a component of disaster recovery, but disaster recovery itself is a much more complex problem to solve. And having the ability to take advantage of the AWS's 9 different regions around the world is great for going down that disaster recovery route. Cloud bursting, where maybe you've got some very spiky workloads, you keep most of those workloads within your 4 walls, but then when you have spikes where you can't meet the capacity in-house, you push some of those workloads to the cloud at peak times, and then when you don't need those resources anymore, you get rid of them. That's a pretty interesting hybrid model where you're running the same application stack both on-premise and in the cloud at the same time, handling those peak traffic loads. And then migrating legacy workloads. Those AS400s sitting in the corner, eventually they're going to have to get decommissioned and re-architected. That's a great time to think about moving those into the cloud as well. Let's look at some more specific use cases. Let's look at storage and backup, because this is a real easy way to get started with hybrid. AWS has something called the AWS Storage Gateway, where you can run a virtual machine in your data center or in AWS. And just last week, in fact, we announced a new feature where we can expose VTL, or virtual tape libraries, on the storage gateway. So if you have backup subsystems today that are using tapes, you can point those backup subsystems at the AWS Storage Gateway, and it will present itself as it was a tape, but everything is going to land in the cloud. It's going to land in Amazon's S3 service and ultimately Amazon's Glacier service. So you get to throw away, well, maybe don't throw away the tapes that you've used already, but throw away those don't buy any more tapes. You can replace them with cloud. I like to think of this, and also the next one that we're going to talk about, is hybrid in a box. All right, so let's look at a bigger storage challenge, which is a common global file system. Maybe you've got a corporate data center on the west coast of the United States. Maybe you have a corporate data center in Tokyo, but you need a global common file system. We have partners out there that can provide you with gateway appliances that present file systems on the front, but on the back end, they're backed by the AWS cloud. They're backed by our S3 service. And so you get the theoretical unlimited storage, and you get that design for 11 nines of data durability so that you know your data is going to be safe. And you know it's going to be, you can point those gateways at specific regions. So if you need to keep your data on the west coast of the United States, you can point those gateways to our services on the west coast of the United States. That's what I like to refer to as hybrid in a box, because you've got file capability on premises at your offices and your data centers, but you're also draining it out the back to the cloud. A couple considerations as you're planning and laying out your infrastructure to go to a hybrid environment. These are some things, these are some mistakes that we've seen companies make as they start to consider hybrid environments on AWS. The first one is networking topology. Almost every enterprise is going to start with virtual private cloud, or VPC. You need to figure out what your network is going to look like as you start to incorporate more and more cloud resources into that network. You want to make it look like an extension of your network. So maybe you're operating a 10./8 network, for those of you that understand that, in your data center. Make sure that as you start to expand into the cloud, that your networks don't overlap. So if you're operating in a 10.0.1 on premises, make sure that those IP ranges don't overlap with the subnets that you're setting up in the cloud. Also, don't be stingy on IP addresses. One of the nice things about the cloud is that you can expand it to thousands of servers. You can allocate thousands of servers very easily. But if those servers can't get IP addresses, if you haven't allocated large enough blocks of IP addresses on the cloud side as you set up your virtual private cloud, you're going to run into some big challenges, and you might have to think about re-architecting your network topology a little bit. So make sure you plan your network very carefully as you consider a hybrid deployment model. The other thing to think about is connectivity. We talked a little bit about direct connect versus the public internet. Understand what your requirements are. You can always change your mind later on, but it's great to understand if you've got high throughput workloads that have to pump a lot of data between your data center and between the cloud, or maybe you have regulatory requirements where certain pieces of data can't traverse the public internet, think about using direct connect. But again, a lot of customers are happy starting with going over the public internet and using IPsec and our VPN capability to tunnel into your VPC. Maybe you start there, figure out what your requirements are going to be, and then you can kind of graduate to direct connections as you get more comfortable working in the cloud and you understand a little bit more what the usage profiles of your applications are going to be once they get in the cloud. And then redundancy. What type of applications are you running in the cloud, and how reliable do those connections between your on-premises data center and the cloud need to be? Maybe you're just doing dev and test in the cloud right now, or maybe you're just experimenting a little bit. And so if that link between your data center and the cloud goes down for whatever reason, maybe you're okay with that. But maybe you're running some mission-critical production workloads in the cloud, and you're in a horizontally deployed environment where maybe your databases are in your data center and your presentation tier is in the cloud. In that case, you probably want to think about building some redundancy into your cloud connectivity. So think about looking at multiple direct connect strategies, and think about a multi-region strategy as well. And then finally, don't forget IAM. This is an important one. How do the people that have been doing things like allocating servers and logging into operating systems and authenticating against your Active Directory in your data center, how do they do that in the cloud? A lot of the tools that we provide in the cloud are going to seem very familiar to everybody. So if you're running Active Directory in your data center, you can run Active Directory in the cloud. But when it comes to allocating the AWS resources, there's some special considerations that you have to give. Not only can they just allocate servers and storage, but can they do transcoding? Can they do data warehousing? Can they do messaging? You know, there's lots of different capabilities in AWS, and so you have to figure out how those translate from your on-premises authentication system to a cloud-based authentication system. And that's the end of the talk in terms of what's next. For those of you that are just getting started in hybrid cloud, everyone in the room should have an AWS account team at your disposal. Both the account managers and the AWS solutions architect are very happy to work very closely with you and answer any questions that you have. So reach out, if you know who your account manager is, reach out to them and ask them how to help you get started. Also reach out to your trusted partners. If you're working with trusted partners today, ask them to help you take a look at moving to a hybrid environment. And there's lots of self-service resources available on AWS. So if you go to AWS website /architecture or /enterprise, you'll find lots of great literature and white papers to help you get started. Thank you.